Good morning and welcome to ESC TV here in Amsterdam. I'm Alan Fraser from the European Society of Cardiology from Cardiff University, and I'm joined for this session by two colleagues, Perla Marang from the Centre for Safety in Healthcare in Delft University, and Stefan Windecker from the Department of Cardiology in the University Hospital in Bern in Switzerland. Thank you both. We're all colleagues in this project called Core MD, which is a European Union funded research program that is led by the European Society of Cardiology, involving 22 different partners in what is now being called regulatory science, the provision of scientific principles and sound methodologies for the regulatory evaluation and approval of pharmaceuticals, but in this specific case, for high-risk medical devices. And this is a 3-year project that has been led by the ESC, and we're now in the 3rd year of this project. What is unusual is that we are engaged with medical professional colleagues in a wide number of associations, with regulators, with notified bodies, with advice from industry, with participation from an international advisory board. So this is a unique collaboration, again led, as I've said, by the European Society of Cardiology. You may be aware of the European system for approving medical devices, and this was a paper published by the Regulatory Affairs Committee of the European Society of Cardiology a few years ago that will give you details. But if you look across the middle of this illustration, you can see that the evidence is presented by a manufacturer to a notified body, which is then responsible for post-market surveillance. The manufacturer submits something called a clinical evaluation report that summarizes all the evidence, and the notified body reviews that and writes something called a clinical evaluation assessment report. Now, neither of those documents is made publicly available in Europe. So we have an issue with transparency that I think we will come back to. But that's why we have been analyzing what data are available before market access and what we should be doing to collect data after market access, so that as clinical cardiologists we can practice evidence-based medicine when we prescribe high-risk devices. So these tasks currently are the responsibility mainly of notified bodies. There is an opportunity for clinicians to give advice through the expert panels run by the European Medicines Agency, and anyone who's interested can apply to become a member of those panels. But what we're going to focus on now is where our project is contributing by reviewing the state of evidence from clinical investigations and by reviewing the quality of our registries and whether we have currently sufficient standards and good enough data collection methods to make those usable. So I'm going to start by asking Stefan to talk about the first of these subjects and introduce that for us. Please, go ahead.
Thank you, Alan, for hosting Perla and myself as part of the Core MD project. And what you will see is that we actually engage into a systematic review of devices which do not pertain only to cardiovascular devices, but importantly also orthopedic and diabetic devices. But as this is a cardiology conference, we will focus of what our institution has done, and that is a systematic review of basically 7 classes of devices which have been depicted on the previous slide, which encompass bioresorbable scaffolds, devices for transcatheter aortic valve implantation, those for transcatheter mitral valve interventions and repair, subcutaneous ICDs, pacemakers, and left atrial appendage occlusion devices. And just to frame the work, I think it's important to note that the medical device environment is important for patients, is important for investigators, but is also an important economic factor in Europe. And as you can see here on the left side of this slide, there have been pioneering first in-man investigations taking place in Europe, notably the first fully implantable pacemaker in 1958. Another highlight, the first coronary stent implantation in 1986. And then more recently, the structural heart interventions, namely LAA closure, transcatheter aortic valve implantation, and so on. And also from an economic point of view, to give you an impression, in Europe there are more than 800,000 employees, which really rivals the amount of individuals that are employed in the pharmaceutical sector in Europe, but most of them are employed in small and medium-sized enterprises. And all these devices are regulated in what we are going to talk about, the MDR. So within the context of Core MD, the purpose of our investigations was to systematically review published clinical evidence from class 3 cardiovascular devices and to assess in a systematic way the quantity and quality of these published clinical data. And we did this over a time span of 20 years, that is from 2000 to 2021. And I will not be able to disclose any of the results at this point in time, but we will present these data for the first time on Monday during a late-breaking clinical science session.
And I think we can add that there will be a publication in the European Heart Journal in the very near future with the results of this study as well, so that colleagues can either come to your presentation or read the results very soon.
Yes.
And we'll talk about the implications in a moment.
So one issue that has been less well established in the European context is the availability of trial results. And there are some publications as to the availability of published reports in the United States, and you'll see them listed here. And one observation is that actually numerous studies, although they have been conducted, are not reported or they are not available in the public domain. So you see a report published in the New England Journal in 2015 of over 13,000 trials, most of them actually in the pharmaceutical area, but also about 11% affecting devices, and only just 13% had been reported at 12 months. And even if you take a longer time period in consideration, that is several years, you see that up to 50% of clinical studies are not reported and their results are not publicly available. So this is certainly an issue that requires attention and improvement.
The issue here is that this comes from the FDA website, which is very transparent, and it's possible to do these studies in North America. But I think you'll say until you've done your recent study, it was not known whether the situation in Europe was the same or different.
Yes, and I think there's an important limitation, as you already alluded to, that the notified bodies are bound by rules of confidentiality. That is, that they have been in the past not obliged to report any kind of information. In the future there will be limited information, but also not the full reports that have been submitted for CE approval. And I think if you take a different angle, and that is, I think, pertinent to this meeting, certainly the way we want to practice medicine is evidence-based, based on the best available evidence. And this is an interesting article published in JAMA in 2019, where actually over the period of 10 years between 2009 and 2019, studies were evaluated lending evidence for a level of A evidence. And what you can observe both in the ACC and AHA and ESC guidelines, that actually only 8 to 14% of recommendations were sufficiently supported by randomized clinical evidence to lend a level of evidence A, the highest level of evidence. And then if you look at the different fields, you see overall there are differences as it relates to certain fields. You see at the bottom, for example, aortic diseases or cardiovascular diseases in pregnancy, which is unsurprising. You see conversely on the top that there is more evidence available as it relates to cardiovascular disease prevention. But overall, what you notice is that quality in terms of evidence available for a level of evidence A has not dramatically changed between 2009 and 2019, and is really in call to action that we need to continue to engage in high quality randomized
We like to think that cardiology is actually one of the medical fields where the evidence base is very strong. But you look at these data, and how do you reflect on that?
Well, I would still maintain that the field of cardiovascular medicine is the field with the best established, prospectively conducted, randomized clinical trials. And it will be interesting to look at the evidence that is available for other devices like diabetes or orthopedic devices. Now, one thing we have done in the past, and that has not been included in the systematic review at this point in time, is coronary artery stents. So this actually was work that we have done under the auspices of the ESC and EAPCI, where we reviewed the available published evidence of randomized clinical trials as it pertains to coronary artery stents. And what this systematic review provided is the best available point estimates as it relates to mortality, myocardial infarction, target lesion revascularization, and stent thrombosis. So arguably the most important endpoints that are important to inform clinicians when they look at a given stent platform. And based on the systematic review, we made specific proposals how coronary artery stents could be evaluated in the future. So if there would be any new device, the recommendation was that prior to an CE approval, there should be a prospective clinical study, not necessarily in a randomized trial, but at least compared to an objective performance criteria, which then, if it would fulfill pre-specified criteria, would be at latest at the stage of post-marketing study, followed by a clinical endpoint, randomized clinical trial against an established standard of care.
Perhaps we can cite this as an example of regulatory science. It's where clinicians have given a systematic and serious scientific summary to regulators for them to introduce for standards for clinical evaluation of new devices, and how we should be contributing after the Core MD project, I think. So thank you very much, Stefan, and let us move straight on to discuss the other half of this equation, which is the availability of evidence after market access. And Perla, you're going to introduce what you've been doing in the project as well.
Yes, thank you, Alan, for hosting us and being able to present this work and highlight the implication. This will focus on post-market surveillance. So what's the evidence that is available on continuous monitoring of these devices after they've entered the market? And we all know that medical device regulation requires this continuous monitoring of the performance, but also safety of these medical devices. And the medical device registries that we have are potentially well suited to fulfill these requirements because they would cover unselected patient populations, so all the patients we treat in daily practice, rather than a selected patient population. For instance, in the trials, they tend to have longer follow-up than we would typically see in a clinical trial. And it would also be very good in capturing the rare adverse events. They may not have surfaced in these clinical trials. So this slide also highlights what is considered a registry in the context of regulatory science, and I've highlighted in yellow the parts that are very important because regulation requires that the population in this registry is representative for the total population, so it cannot cover just a couple of hospitals. So what are then these regulatory considerations? Well, key considerations are, of course, data quality, because we want good quality evidence, but also transparency. And if we look at, for instance, the FDA guidance, but also in other documents, there are two key factors that they use to assess the quality of this real-world evidence. The first relates to relevance. So does the device capture the population it's supposed to surface? Things like, do you have the required data elements? But also importantly, the population in that registry, is that representative? The other aspect is reliability. And that, of course, goes to, do you have procedures in place to check for data quality, but also how complete are you in the registry? Is it capturing all the patients who have received that particular device in the population? So this is just drawing from these two principles. We've selected items that we knew we could review. So we tried to identify in a systematic review all the European registries that fulfill the definition that I've just shown you, and then to review them on whether they would report on these items. And we've not only selected these items based on literature, but also, of course, guided by expert advice of the people active in the registries. For instance, on governance, what type of funding does the registry rely on? Is it mandatory? But also, if we go to the next one on data quality, coverage, does the registry report whether all hospitals in a country or in a region, for instance, are participating? Data quality, and not shown in this slide, but very important, how does the registry report on safety procedures? Do they report on outlier devices, for instance, so that people working in daily practice can access that information? Well, the results that we found are shown graphically here. And if you would like more detail, I would invite you to come on Monday to a session in the Mondrian Hub at 12:45, where it will be explained in more detail. But just to highlight, in terms of what registry in the cardiovascular field, we've included 20 registries, where we started with over 81. This is what they report. And as you see, they tend to report well on things on the left sides, like whether they're a regional or national organization, but less so on the right side in orange and red on data quality, completeness of patients included, and also safety and performance. So for instance, only a third of the registries we've included reported on whether they included all hospitals in a country or region. And no cardiovascular registry reported on patient or procedure level completeness. So do they capture all patients, nor on outlier procedures in that registry.
Perla, you did this for orthopedic registries as well as cardiovascular ones.
Yes.
And here we're presenting the cardiovascular results. And essentially you're showing that unfortunately at the moment our registries are not systematically identifying outlier devices in a way that can be provided to regulators. Is that any different for the orthopedic practice?
Yes, it is. Orthopedic devices have, a good tradition, and we also notice differences. For instance, the cardiovascular registries tended to report on select populations, but not like the total patient population included.
But that perhaps reflects the difference in the use of devices.
Yes.
In that cardiac devices are very often high-risk devices for critical situations.
Yeah.
With a major impact on morbidity or mortality, whereas the orthopedic devices are usually improving quality of life. And it's then important to know the 5, 10, 20-year results. So I think it's true that there's a tradition in orthopedics of relying on data from registries that can be shared with manufacturers and then regulators. And perhaps we need to learn a little bit from that in cardiology, perhaps not over the same timescale, but to some extent more than we're doing at the moment.
Yeah, and I'm not saying that the registries don't have these data. Actually, I think that if they would look at this publication, they could easily say, we do have that type of information, we simply don't report it yet. So yes, I think there is something to learn about the type of information that is relevant for regulators to try and understand, like, okay, what's the performance for all patients for this particular device? So if I would summarize just two key messages from our work, I would say that I realize that there are a lot of other registries that may be very good in terms of data quality. But when it comes to regulatory considerations, that it's important that it's complete and comprehensive, and that we know the quality of this data and evidence in terms of completeness, so that it can be used for regulators, particularly because a lot of the data are collected by clinicians in daily practice. As a next step, what we're going to do is that we're going to try and reach consensus of what would be from this the number of items that we've collected, the minimum number of items you would need as a regulator to really judge the data quality and thereby the quality of the evidence. And if anybody would be interested to participate in that from the clinical point of view, please contact us, because we would welcome any healthcare professionals that want to participate in trying to reach consensus.
Yeah, the European Medicines Agency has a system for approving professionally run registries, and they've officially sanctioned a few as a source of information that they can use. Yeah. But there is no European system yet for approving medical device registries, and that's what we hope to contribute to, I think.
Yes, I agree.
But also within the European Society of Cardiology, colleagues will be familiar with the Euroheart project, and we're aiming to link the work that you're doing with the development of device registries within Euroheart as well, and that's a task for the next few years, I think. But we see from the regulatory science perspective that it's actually a very important contribution that we can make as physicians. I think you'd agree with that.
Yes, I would, and I would be happy to contribute further together with people from Euroheart to try and find ways that they are able to report these type of variables so that regulators can use the evidence.
Yeah. So the theme of this session, apart from highlighting what we're doing in Core MD, is to consider whether we have sufficient evidence for logical clinical practice with medical devices. And Stefan, I'd like to ask you, how do you think clinicians choose the device that they're going to use? Do people go back to the original data? Do they look at the studies? Or is it a slightly more haphazard process at the moment? And how can we influence that perhaps to make the system more rational?
Well, I think there is an important consideration with devices at variance with pharmaceutical agents, that typically a device enters a market for the first time, then undergoes iterations, then at a certain time it enters a stadium of maturity, and with these changes there's also accumulating evidence. And I think with drugs, this is something completely different. They are extensively investigated. There are large-scale randomized clinical trials when they have approval, but these drugs, they don't change over time. And just to mention one example, for example, coronary artery stents, they are really very mature devices. So you have data in thousands of patients, and any new device that comes on the market is investigated in a randomized clinical trial against an established standard, gives you a very good understanding what are the key parameters which I previously mentioned: stent thrombosis, target lesion revascularization, mortality, and myocardial infarction. This is at variance with completely novel devices, and I think in the past 2 decades we have benefited from an avalanche of devices related, for example, to transcatheter valvular heart interventions. And again, if you look at transcatheter aortic valve implantation from the very first in men application in 2002, there were iterative improvements in design which very much improved the clinical safety by reducing complications, followed then by the large-scale randomized clinical trials, where now over a series of 10 years, we actually have a level of evidence A, class 1 indication across the surgical risk spectrum.
What you're mentioning with stents would be an example where the concept of objective performance criteria could be one way for comparing new devices against the mean standard of the existing devices, couldn't it?
Yes, absolutely. And I think one area that will be also of interest, Perla alluded to this, is, for example, from the orthopedic field. They are used to look at long-term aspects of devices. And this is certainly something which pertains to transcatheter heart valves. We are only starting to get data out to 10 years, but what we are really interested in is the long-term durability beyond 10 years. And there, the importance of independent registry of objectively evaluated outcomes will be of paramount importance.
Thank you. Just to mention to colleagues who are with us here in the studio that if you have questions, there are microphones and we could answer quickly any brief questions. But can I come to you, Perla? Do you think we have sufficient evidence from post-market data collection for evidence-based practice, or are there main issues that you think we should be trying to develop and contribute to as clinicians?
Yes, I think that one of the key issues that I would mention, following up on Stefan's remark, that if we looked, for instance, in the evidence that's available in registries, that we would also see that even though most registries, about 90% or so, would typically collect mortality data as an outcome or MACE as an outcome, although in fewer registry, about 40%, then still the definition of even mortality would differ considerably, the number of time points. And of course, that makes it harder to combine data from registries to have a collective evidence, particularly about long-term outcomes, for instance. And we need reliable evidence, so we need sufficient numbers.
And whose responsibility do you think it should be to collect evidence on the performance of high-risk devices once they're available to us, once they're on the market?
Yeah, that's a tricky question, of course, who is responsible, but I think we can contribute as a community, both people involved in registries, but also professionals, to not only register this data, but also as a community to say, well, look, we really want this evidence in the registries, and then to use that in clinical practice.
Legally, within the medical device regulation, the companies are responsible, but I think you would agree that the highest quality evidence from the largest, most comprehensive populations and series would be those who are included in professional registries, such as we run with the European Society of Cardiology and in our national registries as well. Yeah,
and if we don't collect the data, then of course we won't have that type of evidence. So ultimately the quality of the data collection is also our responsibility.
So thank you. I would like to emphasize the importance of transparency, that we need to know what evidence is available for a new high-risk device when it goes onto the market. And Stefan, you're going to reveal for us very soon whether that's the case or not. But then we also need to know the results in the reports afterwards, and we should be able to share those with patients, and we should be able to use them to make our own clinical decisions. And that's what we're trying to develop or contribute to collectively in this project run by the ESC. But we just have a short time before we finish, and I'd like to ask each of you what you think we should be doing as individual clinicians when we make choices of devices. We'll ask you first, Stefan, and then Perla, what is our individual responsibility for collecting data? 30 seconds, 20 seconds each.
Well, I would recommend to follow the guidelines, and we just had a great example of presentation of 5 guidelines during this meeting.
All right.
And I think I would recommend those of you working in practice that they use data from registries with respect to the performance of devices in daily practice in selecting what type of device is best suited for the patient that you're treating.
But I think you'd accept that we have, if you like, a moral responsibility, or at least a duty of care to contribute the data from our patients to registries, even although we don't have a legal responsibility.
Yes, I agree.
So thank you both very much. And for colleagues, just to remind you, there are these 2 sessions on Monday the CoreMD project officially finishes in March next year, there will be many publications and many other special topics, and I encourage you to visit our website, coremd.eu, and you'll get more information. And thank you for attending. Thank you very much.
Thank you.